So, today is officially May of 2025, which means we can also officially say that the Nintendo Switch 2 launches next month. The time that we have been waiting for so long is finally upon us, you guys. It's very exciting. I'm sure most of you guys are extremely pumped as well. And what I wanted to talk about today is maybe some of what we might be able to expect in terms of success for the Nintendo Switch 2, especially when comparing it to the insane success of the current Switch. This actually reminds me of how we all felt leading into the release of the original Switch, and a lot of the conversations we were having back in 2017 before that released, because coming off of the Wii U, which was an amazing console that did not sell well, unfortunately, we all were wondering, what will the Switch do? Will this be successful? Will this be the rebound that Nintendo wants? Will this return to the glory days of the Nintendo Wii, which was the first home console Nintendo ever made that sold over 100 million units? It was a smashing success. And none of us could have predicted what the Switch would ultimately do, now selling over 150 million units worldwide. But we were certainly questioning, what does the Switch need to do to be successful? And I would even say about 6 to 8-ish months into the life of the console, when it was becoming very clear how popular it was, we then started to ask ourselves the question, would it surpass 100 million units in sales? Would it surpass the Wii in lifetime sales? And it might be hard to picture now, but at the time, again in 2017, there were questions on whether or not the Switch could be that popular. And as we all know, that is exactly what happened. The Switch smashed through the records of the Nintendo Wii. And as of today, the last reported numbers, it is at almost exactly 150 million units worldwide. And it is slowly chasing the Nintendo DS family of systems to become Nintendo's most successful piece of gaming hardware of all time. So that brings me back to the main question and the thesis statement of this video, which is, what sales number does the Switch 2 need, quote unquote, to hit to be seen as a success, especially when comparing it to the 150 million units of the Nintendo Switch, of its predecessor console? And I think that opinions are kind of all over the place. I even made a post, or actually it was a tweet on Twitter a few weeks ago, just asking people, what number do you think would make the Switch 2 seem like a failure, and what number do you think would make the Switch 2 seem like a hit or a big success? And everyone's numbers were certainly very different. I shared some of my own numbers, and it was really interesting to kind of get inside of the heads of a lot of you guys and see where everyone's barometer is for success and failure going into the release of the Switch 2, again, now next month. So I'll just cut to brass tacks and tell you guys what I personally feel. I think that the lowest number of sales that would make the Switch 2, I think, seem like a success. Granted, actually, let me give this caveat first. This is just us talking as fans, right? We don't work at Nintendo. We don't work for Nintendo. We're not part of the C-suite and the executive suite of that company or the board of directors at that company that truly knows the hard numbers, okay? So whatever we're saying as fans could be wildly different from what the bottom line actually looks like at Nintendo. So we could say, oh, if it sells 80 million units, it's a success, and if it sells 50, it's a failure. Well, the numbers might say that at 50 million, it actually would still be a financial success for Nintendo. We don't know those details, and those aren't even the numbers I want to predict or make a statement about. I'm just using those as examples, right? So we don't know the numbers. We're just talking more optically what makes it look like a success or a failure from the fans' perspective, okay? Because again, we do not know what the actual P&L looks like at that company. We're just gamers on the internet. I'm just a gamer on the internet. So, that being said, the number that I think, this is Rob's number, okay, as a fan from the outside looking in, that would make the Switch 2, I think, seem like a success. The lowest number to me, I would say, is 60 million. 60 million units compared to the 150 million units that the Switch has currently sold. And I know that that might seem low to a lot of people, but I think that we have to remind ourselves that successor consoles pretty much never sell more than their predecessors. I mean, I guess that might have happened with like the PlayStation 4 compared to the PlayStation 3. And we don't really know where the PlayStation 5 is going to end up. But even if you look at Nintendo's own history, you're generally looking, even at the very successful hardware, whether you're talking home console or handheld, the succeeding system, even when it's a huge hit, doesn't sell nearly as much as the original console, and I think that that will be the truth for the Switch 2. We can even look at the official lifetime sales numbers for all of Nintendo's hardware ever released. Granted, the Virtual Boy is not on here. They don't have numbers for the Virtual Boy, but as far as the rest of their home consoles and their handhelds, all of that stuff is here. And we're going to ignore the first 4 home consoles because they don't really apply to this conversation, even though those are 4 masterpiece systems in my opinion. But if we look at the Game Boy family, for example, you've got the Game Boy on the right that sold 118 million units lifetime, and that's including the Game Boy and the Game Boy Color. And then the Game Boy Advance, another massive hit and the true successor to the Game Boy line, that sold 81 million units. That is huge. That is nothing to scoff at, but it's certainly significantly lower than the 118 million units that the Game Boy sold. I mean, we're talking about 40 million units difference here, but 81 million units, again, is a huge hit in its own bubble. Now, you don't have to tell me that comparing the Wii and the Wii U really skews these numbers, because the Wii U, God, I will just never understand it. One of my favorite consoles of all time, an incredible library, an amazing controller. But look, man, the people just didn't buy in. Nintendo screwed up the marketing in the beginning, and they really just never recovered. So, unfortunately, comparing the Wii and the Wii U does skew this conversation and doesn't really help. But we can still look at the other examples here. The big one being the Nintendo DS and the Nintendo 3DS. The Nintendo DS, 154 million units, still just edging out the current Switch by a few million units. And the Nintendo DS, 75 million units. Just like the Game Boy Advance, an absolutely massive hit of a piece of gaming hardware in its own bubble. But at 75 million units, it is basically almost exactly half of the 154 that the DS sold. And so then again, we look at the Nintendo Switch at 150 million units currently. I feel like it's going to top out around the 155 million lifetime. That's just my prediction. I'm just guessing. Could be more, could be less. Who even knows? But right now, we're looking at 150 million units. And so if we apply the same kind of numbers that we saw from the Game Boy to the Game Boy Advance, or the Nintendo 3DS to the Nintendo DS to the Nintendo 3DS, sorry, we can look at, I think, around half of the lifetime sales could make the Switch 2 optically a success. Now, of course, I gave you my number of 60 million, saying that at 60 million or more, the Nintendo Switch 2 very likely could be seen as a pretty sizable success following the Nintendo Switch. And obviously, that is less than half of the 150 that the current Switch is at. But again, I only used 60 million as the floor. That's like the lowest number that I feel we would be able to say that the Switch 2 is a success. My true prediction, if I was to give more of a prediction on where the Switch 2 might sell, I feel like it's somewhere between 70 and 85 million. So, significantly more than the 60 million. And at 70 to 85 million, that's when we're hovering around, or even higher than, the halfway point to the Nintendo Switch's 150. This is absolutely one of those conversations where, as I talk about it out loud, it just feels very like messy and confusing and crazy, because you're just throwing out numbers: 50 million, 75 million, 60 million, 23 million, 18 million, 13.5 million. And it's like, I know you guys, you know the sales numbers, you know Nintendo's numbers, you understand what I'm saying, but when you spend 5 minutes straight just throwing these numbers out up and down about this system and that system, it just feels like you're speaking gobbledygook. And so hopefully it's coming across coherent in this conversation and you guys can understand what I'm trying to say. But again, to kind of summarize it and get back to the gist of what I'm saying, I think that at 60 million or more, again, this is just me speaking for me, not for you, not for Nintendo. At 60 million or more, we can say, okay, following up the insane lightning in a bottle success that the Switch was at 150 million units, the successor console sells 63 million units. Let's say lifetime ends up being 63 million units. A significant dip from the Switch's 150, but I'm willing to bet Nintendo will still have made money, and I know tariffs makes things a little confusing right now too, but I think that Nintendo will still have made a profit on Switch 2 hardware sales at 60 million or more. And when we factor in probably very strong software sales. That is the other bigger part of any video game company's business and revenue. If the software is still insanely strong at 60 million Switch 2 units, then again, Nintendo will have had another successful generation on their hands, in my opinion. However, I will remind you that I'm still targeting that 70 to 85 million. I mean, if the Switch 2 sells 80 million or more, I think it's going to be a massive hit. Even though that's not really encroaching on the 150 of the current Switch, those are numbers that fall in line with the Game Boy to Game Boy Advance and the DS to 3DS trajectory. That's kind of the general gist of what I'm getting at with this conversation. And I really feel, I know things are a little bit crazy right now, and there's a lot of negativity surrounding the Switch 2 because the messaging has been weird and some decisions aren't great, and Mario Kart is $80 and no one likes a lot of these things. I've talked about it. I don't like $80 for Mario Kart. I really don't like the game key cards thing. So who knows what the Switch 2 ecosystem is going to look like in, let's say, 4 years from today. No one really knows, but I feel like if we were to give it a similar trajectory of success that the Switch had, we can look at that 80 million-ish number and see the Switch 2 as a huge hit. I think a really important sentiment for me to get across in this video and maybe to leave you guys with in this conversation, and I think that this is maybe targeted potentially at a lot of the younger gamers out there, or the gamers who haven't been gaming long enough to have gone through a lot of console generation transitions, right? Is I think the main thing I want to leave a lot of you guys with is that we can't go into the Switch 2 thinking that it needs to sell more than the Switch to be a success. Because, as I showed with some of Nintendo's examples here, that is not what happens, okay? From the NES to the GameCube, each console sold less and less. From the Game Boy to the Game Boy Advance, it sold less. From the Wii to the Wii U, it sold less. From the DS to the 3DS, it sold less. The trajectory for consoles, PlayStation is kind of like this. Xbox is absolutely also a downward trajectory. But in general, the trajectory is still descending. Usually things just sell less until they revamp everything. That's another key part of this too, by the way, is the fact that the Switch 2 is not a revolutionary new device. It's not changing up the hybrid console formula. So it's not introducing something completely brand new, okay? It is a backwards compatible, identical hybrid machine that's just more powerful and has a few hardware tweaks with like the Joy-Cons and whatnot. So that's the other thing. If this was another revolutionary design in console, then we might be having a different conversation. But a huge part of my numbers, when I talk about 60 million to 85 million being a success, it's like that's because it's just another Switch. And that is not a bad thing. I'm not saying that is a negative. It's backwards compatible, so a lot of Switch gamers are going to transition to the Switch 2, and that's going to be part of what this ecosystem looks like. And so it's a long way to say we can't go into this thinking the Switch 2 has to sell more than the Switch to be successful, or that it even has to sell more than 100 million units to be successful. Now, I think if the Switch 2 ends up really just firing on all cylinders, and after the first year we've gotten past all the negative news and people are embracing it, I can absolutely see a future where the Switch 2 also crosses 100 million units. I mean, look, the sky is the limit. Nintendo just has to make the right games and have the right business model to make people happy and make the right business decisions to make people happy, and they can have another 100 million seller absolutely with the Switch 2. It's not really what I'm currently predicting here a month out from the release of the Switch 2, but it's certainly possible. That being said, I'm going to bring it back to reality. I'm going to look at my current target, and this is subject to change with every day, week, month, and year into the Switch 2's life. But right now, I think 70 to 85 million, around the half mark, the half selling number of the current Switch. That's what I think the Switch 2 is probably going to do. And like I said, to me, it's going to be a success. Nintendo will see it as a success. We should see it as a success. Don't let people tell you that 80 million Switch 2s will be seen as a failure because the Switch sold 150 million. That is not going to be the case. Look at the history of the Game Boy and the DS family of consoles. That's just how these things usually work. So these are just some of my off-the-cuff thoughts and predictions and ideas about the Switch 2's sales success and sales potential. Again, basically 1 month away from the release of the console. So You know, if it's 2028 and you're coming back to this video to see what did Rob say way back in 2025 about the Switch 2, let's compare his prediction to what's actually happening. If you're coming here in 2028, well, then I don't even know what you're doing, because how could I possibly know the future? This video is being made in 2025, a month before the Switch 2 comes out, when none of us know what's actually going to happen. There's a chance the thing totally bombs. Maybe it sells 21 million units, 25. I mean, maybe it does something crazy like what the Wii U did. And I know the Wii U did 13.5, but I'm just saying that kind of a drop from the prior console to the new console. Maybe the Switch 2 is a huge bomb. I absolutely do not expect that, but hey, you never know. I'm recording this video before the Switch 2 is out. That's the point of this part of the video. So anyway, these are my thoughts. Like I said, off the cuff. Very exciting to see what the future holds. I can't wait to have my Switch 2 in just 4 or 5-ish weeks. Very, very close. I can taste it. Share your own thoughts and predictions below. Thanks, of course, for tuning in, guys, and I will see you next time.